And then beyond all that, when you look at the human cost, which we always have to consider, you start to wonder what the money spent fighting the war is actually achieving. Central and South America, well, they've got the second and third highest homicide rates in the world, respectively. Colombia itself, the highest number of internally displaced people in the world, up to 5 million of them. And the United States has an estimated 6.2 million cocaine users. In 2010, 1.6 million people in the United States were arrested on some sort of drugs charge. So again, and we keep asking this question over and over again, is this war working? Let's ask Dr. Kevin Sabet. He's an assistant professor at the University of Florida College of Medicine, a former advisor as well to multiple White House administrations on national drugs policy. Dr. Sabet joins us from Boston. The Mexican drugs cartels, as I said there, they rake in about $40 billion a year. The US spends the same on the war on drugs. If this was a business transaction, you'd say government's not getting value for money.
Well, I would argue that they are, although I think the numbers are probably closer to 20 billion when you look at federal numbers. Of course, state and local are mainly covering the expenses for treatment and prevention. But when you look at actually the costs of doing nothing, we would see that we would be much more in the hole there. If you look at our legal drugs, for example, right now, alcohol and tobacco alone cost the United States over $400 billion in lost social costs. That's from loss of productivity to healthcare costs to premature death and illness. We get about $40 billion in revenues from those two legal drugs. So that's about a 10-to-1 ratio. And we know that legality and legalization would simply increase use and availability. So that doesn't mean we can't make improvements of current policy. Of course we should. Anybody looking at this issue would agree with that. But to offer such an extreme response, as many have, to legalize drugs, we'd be much more in the red than we'd want to be.
Well, let me quote you something here, and for our viewers as well. This is from the Office of National Drug Control Policy Reauthorization Act of 1998, which basically says no federal funds shall be spent on studying or, in fact, anything related to the legalization of these substances. I mean, to talk about it, to study it, to put some money into the idea, you couldn't call that an extreme idea. That's just looking at all sides of the story and considering all possible options.
Yeah, I mean, I'm in favor of looking at those sides, and in fact, more and more people have called for a debate on this internationally. I think a lot of people are ready to have that debate. Now, that debate is very different than just presenting one side of it, which I think a lot of this has been, and saying that legalization is the only answer to our current problems. We know that if we invest more in reducing the demand in the United States, so that's prevention, treatment, but it's also intervention, it's working with the criminal justice system with things like drug courts, which have proven to be effective, things like testing and sanctions programs and probation. There's a whole host of things that can be done to do a much better job of reducing demand in the U.S. On the other side of it, though, internationally, it also tells us that we need to invest more in alternative livelihood, more in combating institutional corruption and financial crimes. I mean, the idea that legalization would wipe out the institutional problems that, for example, is going on in Mexico, as the example you brought up, is ludicrous. There are fundamental problems related to poverty, related to healthcare, related to education, related to corruption, related to policing. We could go on and on. Those things need to be dealt with one by one in a comprehensive way, sort of like we did in Colombia. If I can just say, Plan Colombia, which was President Clinton's major achievement in Latin America, was also ran also by President Bush, a bipartisan effort. This was a country, 15 years ago that you could not go to. There were no tourists. There were people being killed left and right. There was institutional corruption, up and down the political spectrum. And when we actually worked with partners in the region and invested in not only things like Apache helicopters, but you need those too, but also invested in the people of that country, invested in alternative livelihoods, gave people a chance. We've seen a major turnaround, and it's really a huge success story that's barely talked about. Imagine if we did that in these other countries, if we learned and applied the lessons that we learned in Colombia, which has now made Medellin, which is shocking to even think about, is a top 10 travel destination by National Geographic. I mean, it's a wonderful turnaround story. Why don't we do that and try and apply those lessons in those other countries? And I think until we actually make that effort, to say that we need something as extreme as legalization is pretty irresponsible.
Yeah, okay, but what about the flip side to what happened in Colombia? You've given us all the positive examples there. What about the idea that it actually just spread the problem further afield in South America and Latin America, and that you've actually you still got the same number of users just elsewhere?
Yeah, well, that's my point. I mean, so the point is when you only work in one country then, in one area, and you don't implement those same policies in the region, you are going to have that displacement effect, or as some have said, push down, pop up. And that's a real concern, but I wouldn't say that's a fault of the policy. That's a fault of not implementing that policy throughout the region. And so, today, and you're right, I mean, today we have, for example, cocaine is far less in terms of the cost has increased, the purity has decreased, which means that the cocaine producers, especially in Colombia, are really on the run. But you're right, they're just being displaced. They're now moving through West Africa, presenting that region with a whole host of problems now with drugs, and moving drugs to Europe through the African corridor. That's a major problem as well. So this is obviously a global issue. We need to tackle it everywhere. We can't focus on one place and hope it's gonna go away. And this idea that legalization then is going to make these drug cartels pack up and go home is totally ludicrous when you look at the actual situation of the cartels. These people are dealing with human trafficking. They're the biggest purveyors of piracy issues and illegal goods. They're dealing with many other drugs other than marijuana. In fact, a recent RAND study said that marijuana is just a small minority of the revenue that Mexican drug cartels, Mexican drug organizations get. So this idea that if you legalize one or even a few drugs and that's going to solve the cartel problem doesn't measure up with reality. Unless you started to legalize human trafficking, piracy, methamphetamine, cocaine, then we could see what would happen with the underground market. But I don't think we're prepared to do that.
I notice you keep using the word legalization, which, as you said, is maybe a bit extreme. But what about taking a step back from that? The thing that, in fact, a lot of leaders in Latin America are saying, and that is decriminalization or regulation, treating drugs the same way that we treat, not exactly the same way, but using the model, if you like, of alcohol and tobacco.
Right.
What about that sort of idea, rather than the legalization, as you say?
Well, that idea is legalization. So that latter idea you talked about of alcohol and tobacco, those are legal drugs. Regulation is another word for legalization. So that's one side. And as I said, our experience with alcohol and tobacco shows that there's a 10-to-1 ratio in terms of costs to revenues. So it's not a tax gainer. And in fact, we know that when you put excessive taxes on these goods, for example, tobacco, you see an underground market. And the underground market of cigarettes is thriving, especially in the United States, in the eastern United States. When Canada put a $3 tax levy about a decade ago on cigarettes, they had an underground market come up the next day. So this idea that these endemic black markets for illegal drugs that have been there for decades are going to go away under what you call this regulation or legalization doesn't add up to the experience. Now, you talk about decriminalization, and I think that word is often thrown around interchangeably with legalization. Those are obviously two different things, but remember, Mexico already has decriminalization. So Mexico has, in fact, taken away the idea of a criminal sanction against somebody with small amounts. So that's already happening, and I don't think that that's curtailed the cartels at all. In the United States, marijuana is effectively decriminalized. In most states and localities where people might be arrested and given a short record for an arrest, it's really no more than a parking ticket in most cases where it's marijuana only. And so, the idea that, let's decriminalize, we're actually experimenting with that in many parts of the region. It doesn't touch cartels. In fact, if anything, research has shown that decriminalization could almost have even a perverse effect, because if it leads to increased use, but it doesn't cover and doesn't touch the black market, because under decriminalization, the production and trafficking is still illegal. But if it increases use, then you actually have more users, more of a demand, which just fuels the cartels even more. So you're right, we need to make these policy distinctions, but we need to be careful to throw labels around that mean, 10 different things to 10 different people.
Dr. Kevin Sabet, they're giving us some US perspective on how the war on drugs is being fought. Thank you for your time, sir.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
We've mentioned Mexico a lot in this program, quite simply because it's at the heart of the debate. 95% of cocaine that arrives in the United States, for example, transits through the Mexico-Central America corridor. That means billions of dollars in profits, of course, for the drugs cartels. But it also means the economy is getting a kind of backhanded boost. We'll let Adam Rainey explain in this report from Mexico City.
Money. Lots of it. By some estimates, $40 billion are generated by Mexico's drug trade. The bloody drug war has left more than 50,000 people dead, but also left behind a trail of profits as drug smuggling to the United States continues and the internal drug market in Mexico grows bigger year by year. But what do Mexico's major drug traffickers buy with all that cash? As auctions show, gold-plated guns, jets, and cars are just a few of the items. Mexico's so-called narco museum has even more drug runner fashion on display. Clearly, narco gang fashion is all about the bling. Still, with billions of dollars at their disposal, luxury items aren't the only thing. They're buying up stocks, real estate, even hotels and tourist resorts like Cancun. Some of the dirty cash is smuggled across the U.S. border in the back of trucks. Some of it crosses the border electronically in massive bank wire transfers. And with all their cash, drug cartels have come up with all kinds of ways to clean their money once it's in the country. In some parts of the country, beauty salons and spas are used as fronts. In others, construction firms pad their buildings with higher estimates and the money is cleaned up that way. Throughout the country, Mexicans consider empty restaurants a sign that the establishment could be a front to launder millions of dollars. Although it's far from the front line to the drug war, Mexico City is considered to be a place where lots of drug money laundering is taking place. In fact, the U.S. government has a list of 500 businesses and individuals in Mexico that it suspects of laundering money for drug gangs. And on that list is this restaurant right here. The U.S. government suspects it of laundering money for perhaps one of the most powerful and largest drug gangs in Mexico. We asked the manager if the report has hurt the restaurant's business. He refused to let us film on the premises, but off camera, he called it a ridiculous report and said lawyers are dealing with the allegations.
Of US dollars.
We asked the head of the UN Office for Drugs and Organized Crime in Mexico how so many suspected money launderers could operate in the open.
Developing investigation that allow to really prosecute a big money launderer are extremely complex. And are extremely complex not only because of the technicalities, also because when you investigate financially important people, you know from the very beginning that you will encounter a number of obstacles in your investigation. It's much easier to investigate and jail a small drug trafficker rather than a big tycoon that among his many financial activity also offered his financial structure for laundering money.
So if we know who these people are, why aren't authorities going after them?
Because through their money, they buy impunity and they create the network that allow them to operate with impunity.
Mexican politicians and authorities say they have weak laws to chase down money launderers, but a new law to make money laundering tougher is making its way through the Congress.
Exactamente.
Former prosecutor Samuel Gonzalez says it's going to take time for Mexico to really tackle the problem of money laundering, especially with so many businesses not wanting to really change the status quo.
Nuestros empresarios y las personas que están en México normalmente
Mexican businessmen normally don't set up preventative measures against money laundering because they know the justice system is weak, and as a result it can be circumvented with good lawyers or corruption. Therefore, Mexican businessmen aren't proactive in preventing laundering or other crimes because they know they can deal with it in other ways.
A culture of inertia and impunity unlikely to change anytime soon, and until it does, Mexico will be awash in drug money.